Monika Schulz. I am the Interim CEO Task Force Chair with the ASAE Foundation, and with me is Jim Zaniello with Vetted Solutions. ASAE embarked in a collaboration with Vetted Solutions and Ancora Group on this research project focused on interim CEOs. What we set out to do was to identify the effective practices of interim CEOs, the process or conditions that help them succeed, and the different perspectives, board, staff, subsequent CEOs, and the interim CEOs, and what enabled them to be successful in these changes. The research really demonstrated how vital an interim CEO can be to an organization during a leadership transition and really part of an overall succession plan. The findings were based on in-depth interviews with 15 different organizations from all four perspectives: board, staff, both sets of CEOs. The reports that are being released outline some really key takeaways from each of these four perspectives that we hope you will find interesting. The initial reports that you will see are snapshots. The in-depth report will be released later this year by the foundation. It really shows how an interim CEO can be a successful and integral part of a CEO transition and change. There are a couple of really great takeaways that we're going to talk about from the different perspectives. One of them that really stuck out for me was really 4 focus areas for a successful interim CEO. Key traits: deep knowledge of association management, high emotional intelligence, being highly adaptable, and really fitting into the organizational culture. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. But Jim, I'd love to hear some of your observations.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm thrilled, and I want to thank the ASAE Foundation for conducting the research. It's not been done in our space before, so I think that's exciting. I also obviously want to thank the Ancora Group. They've got years of experience, and I'd say are some of the most important leaders in this work in our space. What I thought was exciting was, again, first and foremost, that we actually now have data. We now have research that other associations can use as they go on their interim journey. I like that there are takeaways for boards, for those who are considering being interim CEOs, those who are already in the interim CEO role, advice for the CEOs that come in on a more regular basis after the transition. And then I really love that ASAE and the foundation also have some really terrific advice for staff. You know, everybody's impacted by a CEO transition, but the staff who remain, who are the constants day to day, probably have the toughest time of all during a transition. And so to see some key takeaways for them, I thought was really terrific.
I think one of the most surprising things that I found in the research was that only 14% of the organizations that were interviewed had actual succession plans. And one of the most significant things an organization can go through it is a leadership transition. And so for larger organizations, there is a depth in talent, and so finding an interim is really probably a little bit easier. But for small and mid-sized organizations, like my former employer, there is not that capacity. And so having this research to really showcase what boards should be considering when they're looking at interim talent, I think is a great key takeaway. I think the other really exciting part of this research is the success factor for the subsequent CEO. Being a CEO that came into an organization that had an interim, some of the key observations that came out of the research was having an overlap time with the interim of 2 to 3 weeks if they're not an internal candidate, and making that onboarding process really so much easier. Now, my situation, the interim is still on staff, but is a key partner in my transition as I onboard. Anything exciting that you kind of saw there, Jim?
Well, I like that it drew some information around planned transitions, unexpected transitions, and then involuntary transitions, right? So how you might approach succession planning. Well, to your point, everybody should be thinking about succession planning, should have a solid succession plan in place that includes interim leadership, should be reviewed every year by the board and the CEO in hopes that you never need it, but that it's there and can be finalized once something happens. But having a thought around how we handle the interim leadership when we've got a planned departure, I'm giving 3 months notice per my contract because I have a new job, or I'm going to retire at the end of next year. That's one approach. You've got the unexpected, which might be more of the, I'm stepping out of the workforce for elder care issues, for other family issues, for just some time away before coming back into an association. We're seeing a lot of that now. And so the approach to interim leadership and what's particularly needed in that situation in terms of high emotional intelligence in the interim leader is important. And then certainly if it's an involuntary or truly unplanned transition, there's a lot of work the interim CEO is going to do, but the most important work there is probably that work with the board and the staff in particular, the members as well, but in ensuring an environment where everybody's comfortable, everyone has access to information, and everybody feels good about the transition.
I know that my experience at my last organization, a small organization, $2 million budget, a board where I gave notice, 60-day notice, but no talent that could step into that space. So one of the things, as you look at the takeaways for the board, is really the conversation that the board should be having, that having an interim is absolutely a feasible and great way to transition into new leadership. I would say a key part of the succession journey is to include a search firm who has access to talent and who has access to being a great partner in recruiting the interim. My board did go down that journey of interviewing search firms while I was still on the team. And then really the search firm that was selected having the capacity to bring people on board to interview with the board and to interview also with the staff. And they did end up hiring an interim that helped them transition a period of time because they knew they needed some time to really know what they were looking for in their next leader and to have some strategic conversations. And having an interim CEO really gives you that capacity to do that. And that's exactly what they did. And they just recently hired their replacement. I know the research does say that if you're an interim CEO that you should not be in the search process. And I think that that probably is a really pretty key takeaway so that you can really take a look at the internal operations of an organization.
I think that's one of the most important takeaways. The interim exec should be positioned for success. And a lot of times that might mean needing to address things that either the previous exec couldn't, wasn't given the chance to by the board, but where sometimes the board does actually listen differently to someone in the interim. I also think the interim shouldn't have designs on the job. Therefore, if they're not a candidate, they can't. But you can give better advice as an interim if you don't have designs on the job. It's why we think strongly about an external candidate as the interim. Not only does that individual have the freedom to bring their knowledge in, but to make decisions in the best interest of the organization because they're moving away. But even if you have a really well-liked, highly talented internal candidate who doesn't want the CEO spot, he or she still has to go back into the role that they were in, still has to work on a day-to-day basis with their colleagues. And sometimes it can be challenging for an internal interim candidate or exec to bring about some of the change that's necessary because they have to go back to, and they want to go back to, working positively with their colleagues and peers on the team.
I think the other really, in my experience at my last organization, one of the other items that really helped the new CEO was the capacity. The team was a little bit in upheaval with the transition, and there were some staff shifts. And so the interim was able to line up some talent and outsource some of the operations so that when the subsequent CEO came in, they already had a number of things already lined up. which is a great way so that you can kind of hit the ground running. It also gives you the capacity to sit down with the board and not have to do crisis management, but really have the ability to thoughtfully look at, what are the next iterations for the organization. On the other side, I did in my current new position, I followed an interim, so I am the subsequent CEO, and it has been an incredible resource as being on a listening journey and having the ability to have someone in-house that was part of the senior team and continues to be part of the senior team and is an integral partner. So as a subsequent CEO, I think that, like the research said, having that overlap, if they're not an internal candidate, but having the time to really listen to their perspectives and how they've worked with the board and culturally what they've seen internally with the team.
Well, why I think an interim worked in the instance of the organization you're now with is that this individual had strong respect from the board. He had earned that. He also had a good reputation with the staff, and so they knew him to be a straight shooter, right? Someone who was an honest broker of information, someone they trusted, and someone who had the organization's best interests at heart. And so I think in that instance, an internal interim could work well for those reasons. And as you've talked about, great continuity with the board could help you understand the history behind things, the political side of things that an external interim couldn't handle. And given that you're taking your organization through some really exciting change, that knowledge was helpful to the search process, I'm sure, but certainly your transition and for other staff as well.
I think one of the things that you'll notice in the research is there is a fair amount of conversation or research data that shows part of this crisis piece, interims coming in a crisis piece. And did you want to talk a little bit more about that, Jim?
Yeah, it's interesting because there are a lot of people who would naturally say, oh, I've been a leader, I've been a CEO, I can step into an interim role. And I don't think every leader and every CEO can step into an interim role, or maybe they can with some guidance and coaching. The role of the interim draws upon some skill sets that any leader would bring, draws on some skill sets a CEO would bring, but understanding what the role is and what the unique measures of success are in what could be a 3 to 6 month interim process. These days, quite frankly, it could be 9 to 12 months. And we're quite frankly seeing some of these that go 2 full years if we're talking about mergers and acquisitions, or if we're talking getting to a new business model before recruiting a new CEO. But the most important thing is someone who, again, has no designs on the job, can offer sound advice to the board and staff, someone who has deep emotional intelligence, as we've talked about. This is, as you just said, Monika, a difficult time for everybody. And so someone who can help address issues around culture, around staff's concern of, will I have a job when the new CEO comes in, or are they bringing their own people? And someone, quite frankly, who can help the staff get ready for a new exec. During a transition, staff don't always have up-to-date job descriptions. It's a perfect time for staff to update them so that on day 1 or week 1 with the new CEO, they can show up for the meeting, share the job description, talk about their existing role, and then talk about where they see opportunity for the organization. But a good interim CEO can help foster all of that so that the role of the successor exec, the successful exec, is that much easier in terms of a learning curve.
I think one of the other things that this affords us when you have this conversation with your board is really setting clear expectation levels of what the board's looking for in an interim. The research really clearly shows that that is a really healthy conversation to have, to set clear expectation levels. And it also is an opportunity for the discussion with the board to be on what it is that they are looking for in their next CEO and to really help with that transition. So I feel like one of the data reports that you really should take a look at it is the board piece, because that is a really critical conversation for any leader to be having.
If I could just jump in. I mean,
Absolutely.
that's one of the things that a good interim can do, right? In a vacuum, boards tend to think about stepping into day-to-day operations. Yes. An interim exec can help keep them out of that. Now, if the culture is that the board has been very involved, and part of the shift the organization wants is to a more strategic governance approach, the interim exec can sort of softly advise the board to say, you've said you want to get to strategic governance, not being involved in the day-to-day. This isn't great behavior. How can we work with you to change this before we bring in a truly strategic exec so that she can help achieve all that you want, because they're not spending the early days sort of helping you think about how to get to strategic governance.
I want to shift it a little bit into interim CEO and how that fits in the overall succession planning of an organization. Like I said, one of the surprising points to me, and I will say I was a culprit of this too at my last organization, is not having a formal succession plan and sitting through some ASAE sessions with my board leadership and them saying, we really need a formal succession plan. And then having an opportunity to move on and having to go to your board and say, hey, I'm leaving, and now what? So I think one of the things that's so critical is having that conversation early with your board on what does formal succession planning look like, and how key the interim CEO a key element is potentially having an interim. So do you see with people that you work with, this need for a succession plan and how the interim fits into that scope?
Every association should have a succession plan for its CEO. Should also have one for its board chair, quite frankly. Sometimes, particularly on the trade association side, you sometimes see a quick departure there. And ideally, every association has a succession plan for, at a minimum, the C-suite. If it's a small organization, a succession plan for every position, because in a 5-person or a 2-person organization, if you lose one person, you've lost a big portion of your workforce. So CEO succession planning is critically important. If an organization doesn't have one when we start the CEO search process, one of the last things we do as the search concludes is say, put a CEO succession plan in place now. This is the easiest time to do it because you've just been through a transition. You've got all the great knowledge of what you wish you had beforehand, and it's a non-threatening time to do it because the new CEO knows that you've just been through a transition. They too will bring valuable lessons you could put into that plan. And it's just an easy way to say this is a part of the business process. It's really continuity planning, quite frankly.
And I think the concept of an interim is such a critical, something that you don't have the conversation all that much sometimes, but I think really, particularly for small and mid-sized organizations, is really a key element and a great way of bridging the gap between the two.
The interesting thing, and I'm segueing a little from CEO interims to senior staff interims, if you have the chief marketing officer, the chief member engagement officer transition because they were recruited away, sometimes that succession piece could be someone on the team who may be ready and you want to try it out before going to a public search. Other times it might be somebody who's not yet ready, but you want to make this a part of their professional development journey as a way to keep them with the organization and help develop their skills, whether it's around people management or budget management or broader impact. So I think we'll see more of that. Again, I think the CEO succession plan should be reviewed with the board every year. Maybe that's tweaked a little bit based on the organization's business model or finances. It should give board members comfort to know that there is a plan to start with. And the other thing we say at the beginning of every transition is it's okay for the board to say to the membership, as surprised as we are by this transition, we're actually going to enact our succession plan. And often with either very big members, if that's the case, or other key funders, they're comforted to know that you'd sort of been planning for this in case it happened, and that you've got a plan to enact immediately. And so it should, at the start of a transition, give everyone greater comfort that the transition will be well managed and that there'll be no loss of service, right? That's the other thing. whether you're the new CEO coming in and the interim says, hey, we kept the trains running on time beautifully while we were waiting for you, or they were able to get some other things done, it does just make the opportunity that much stronger, right? Candidates who ask a board, well, what are you doing on the interim? And they hear, well, we're really just sort of humming along without an interim. We're going to be okay. That's a different conversation with top talent than when they can say, we've invested in an interim so that when you step in, this organization is as well run as it can be by the time you get there. And again, to your point, it makes such a difference in your early days.
It really does. Being from both perspectives, I know that the anxiety level of my board when I gave my resignation was helped by having someone come in that had association management experience. And I know that me walking into a new role, it gave me the opportunity to know that there was someone there that had been working with the board and that could give me insights into transitioning and listening. So it was a great segue in both spaces.
I mean, if you start with the succession plan and then you conclude the transition with an onboarding plan, that allows a new exec to be as successful as possible. And ideally, that final onboarding plan starts with the search committee and the newly hired exec. It certainly should be impacted by the interim exec. They're going to have day-to-day observations that no one else might have. And then the board, whether it's the governance committee or executive committee, may also want to weigh in on that document. But that onboarding plan should then take the new exec and the staff and the board through the first year